Ned Helme is the president for the Center for Clean Air Policy. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
How are you feeling right now? What is your reaction to the climate change legislation? Looks like it's not going anywhere in the Senate before Copenhagen. How big do you think that will be?
I think it's much bigger that the president made the announcement he did last week. I think we'll get back to the legislative process in the spring. I think that's appropriate. But I think the key at what happens in Copenhagen was the president's decision last week to set the 17% below 2005 levels as a U.S. target. All the other major countries had stepped up and set targets, and it was critical that he did that. I think he deserves a lot of credit for it.
Were other countries waiting to hear from the United States to see if we would be working on that?
Absolutely. You saw China came out the day after. They were clearly waiting. That had been discussed, I think, during the meetings in Beijing, and they were waiting for our signal. I think it was a positive signal.
What are the major sticking points in negotiation?
Well, there's two pieces that really matter here. One is the target, which we've settled last week, and the other is whether or not there's financing. The agreement at Bali 2 years ago was that basically developing countries would take national actions that would be monitorable, reportable, and verifiable in return for financing from the wealthier nations. And so we've taken care of the target. We said everybody stepped up with the target, and now we need to step up on the financing side of this equation.
Okay, we have a Washington Post story from Thursday, Thanksgiving Day of last week. President Obama to set goals to reduce emissions, and you are quoted as saying that the president is walking a knife's edge to encourage China and India to act without alienating Congress. It's a calculated risk, but it's the right play. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, I think he's in a very narrow space. You know, on the one hand, he had to take a stand that would encourage India and China that we would in fact take a stand, and he also had to do it in a way that didn't hurt his chances in terms of Congress. I think he did it very well, because I think the key for the Congress, for 12 years, Congress has been asking for action from India and China and Brazil and Korea and so on. And we now have that. We now have a situation where every major developing country has stepped up in the last 2 weeks and said, here's our target. So I think he's in a very good position to say, I've met the goal Congress wanted, I've gotten these other countries to step up, and now we have to step up and do our part and pull this through. So I think it was a balancing act, but a very, very skillful one.
Ned Helme, president of the Center for Clean Air Policy, can take your calls. Democrats 202-737-0002, Republicans 202-737-0001, and Independents 202-628-0205. Let's go to North Carolina, Charlotte, where Martha is on the Democrats line. Hi, Martha. Go ahead, Martha. You're on the air. I think we might have lost Martha. All right, let's move on to Minneapolis, where Patty is on the Republicans line. Hi, Patty.
Hi. I'm wondering if your guest or you yourself are aware of the hacking of the UK's climate global warming site, where they were the so-called scientists were talking about deleting their records if it should get out, how they had manipulated temperatures for certain years, how if a scientist wrote in a journal disputing and being accurate about it, some of their claims, that they would be ostracized, and then they would, if the journal printed what the scientist wrote, that then they would discredit whatever journal they were writing in. Are you aware that this whole farce is being exposed? And also C-SPAN, I'd like to know why you guys, you had a little bit about it on Sunday, but none of the newspapers and the drive-by media are talking about it. It's a huge story. It is a farce. It absolutely is. And there are thousands of scientists who disagree with this Al Gore baloney. You know, that isn't my first choice of words. Baloney about global warming.
Yeah, I'm aware. I saw Andrew Revkin's story in the New York Times about this East Anglia thing, and I think it's really unfortunate this kind of thing goes on among the scientists. But I think the key here is that the scientific issue is behind us in terms of climate. It's clear, it's decided. You know, I've worked in this field for 40 years, and basically we're at a point where there's more agreement among scientists on this than there have been on many and most of the air pollution issues and other things that have been talked about over the years in terms of the science. There's always difference of opinion. I think it's unfortunate, this particular story, the way it's been handled and the kinds of things that happen. I think the other thing to look at is, major corporations around the country now support action on climate change. Everybody from Shell to British Petroleum to Entergy, a major utility in Louisiana, Florida Power and Light, any number of major corporations have seen that this is a key issue and that we need to address it. So I think, it's unfortunate this kind of back and forth on the science, but I think that issue is behind us, and it's now about really changing our strategy on energy and moving forward. And I think there's broad support across the country for doing that. We saw there's a poll, I know on the Republican line, there's a poll in today's paper in the Post indicating that 56% of Republicans feel the Senate Republican leadership should engage the Democrats in working through this legislation. I think that's where our focus should be.
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Rick is on the independent line.
Hello, good morning. I just wanted to comment, basically, the hoax is up. The emails were leaked out by the hackers out of universities out in Europe about how, basically, emails were about, or communications between the scientists showing that they were trying to manipulate the data, and like the last caller said, it's a huge story, and no one's talking about it. I wanted you to comment on it, and if you don't know about these emails, you can go after the show, you can go Google them, and it's all over the internet. And I wanted the viewers to know about it, how this is all a hoax.
As I said to the previous caller, I don't think it's a hoax at all. In fact, there's more scientific agreement on the issue of climate change than any major environmental issue in the last 30 years. So I simply don't accept that. I do think it's unfortunate the hackers did what they did, and I think it's unfortunate the kind of personalization that's happened among scientists. It's not the way to do business. But in terms of the issue, I think we should stay focused on the issue and the fact that most of our corporate leadership, most of our political leaderships, and the world leadership sees this as a major issue that needs to be addressed.
Give us a preview of Copenhagen. What do you see as the important factors going into it, and what do you hope to see happen there?
I think at one level we're going to settle on these two big issues, sort of what is the target, what levels of targets are each country committing
Emissions
to.
Targets.
Emissions targets. I think very significant. We're seeing each of these countries stepping up together, and I think that's a way to think about this. This is a tough issue. Everybody sees this as having impacts on your competitiveness, your steel industry, your cement industry, your aluminum industry. And so what we're seeing here is all the countries stepping up together, which makes it safe for everybody to go where we need to go. So I think that's first and foremost the most important thing. And the other one is the financing. Will we see significant commitment? And we're not talking about bushels of money. We're talking about targeted assistance to developing countries to help them with advanced technologies, to help them with energy efficiency and financing of key energy efficiency saving opportunities. I think those two pieces are the key to what happens in Copenhagen.
Story in the Washington Times today, money may help lead to accord, developing nations reluctant. And Charles Hanley reports that money on the table, perhaps $10 billion a year or more, could help close a deal in Denmark next month and keep climate talks moving toward a new global treaty in 2010. But if poor nations are offered too little up front, the UN conference could end in discord. The money would help developing countries cope with ocean flooding, drought, and other effects of climate change, while also helping them cut down on emissions of global warming gases.
I agree. I think that's exactly right. The Europeans have said we need to have a fast start to this new National Appropriate Mitigation Action structure. And what that means is probably $6 to $8 billion a year between now and 2012. And the U.S. administration has requested $1.3 billion from the Congress, the appropriation bill. I think that's a good start. I think the Congress is ready to step up and perhaps put a little more in, and certainly the Europeans are ready to put more in. So I think you're right. I think one of the tests, it won't be so much the commitments on how much in 2030, but the commitments right now to get started, because we need to get this game underway in a big way immediately.
Roseville, Michigan, Amanda's on the Republicans line. Good morning, Amanda.
You're saying push this through as fast as you can, and you're also saying that, this is all behind us, the scientists, which are all government, state-paid scientists, who all happen to agree because the scientists that they use are the ones that are being paid to go ahead with this farce, fake climate change. Al Gore and all these people, United Nations, Moon, all these people, it's just a big agenda that's been going on for years and years. It's a big joke. It's a farce. And this email, these hacked emails threatening scientists that disagree, losing important information that shows that it's a big farce. All this stuff needs to come out. Just like the lady before said, the drive-by media, nobody's covering it like it should be because it's huge. And it's huge, and you guys want to ram it through as fast as you can because you know it's a joke, it's a farce.
I think the scientific work has been funded by a wide variety of governments and foundations and other entities. It's not funded by a single government or single entity, and it's a very coordinated, the international process is a very coordinated scientific process with careful peer review of the results and so on. So I think it's very well documented, well supported. Nobel Prize was awarded for the work that was done by the IPCC. So I think your contention is really not on the money in terms of that piece. But I think the key here, again, is we know we face significant impacts. We've seen the greater severity of hurricanes. We've seen the impacts already in terms of forest resources and so on. It's time to get started. I mean, there isn't much time left to get this problem reversed. We're basically turning around a huge tanker, you know, like a super tanker. And we can't get there very quickly. It takes a while. Once you got that ship turned around, then we can move forward. I think that's what you got to look at as Copenhagen. This is really about turning that tanker around, moving forward, and we'll pick up speed once we've got everybody on board and moving, and that's what we need to do at Copenhagen.
Piece in the Washington Post today, carbon credit dispute threatens new climate deal. Russia wants its surplus carried over, but environmentalists call it counterproductive and unearned. And the piece talks about how Russia is on track to exceed its targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions under the Kyoto Climate Change Treaty. The piece by Philip Pan says, at issue is the thorny dispute, the huge surplus of carbon credits that Russia, the world's third largest producer of energy-related greenhouse gases, is amassing by keeping emissions under generous 1997 Kyoto Protocol limits. The Kremlin has insisted that the credits be carried over into a new agreement, but environmentalists say that would cripple any treaty by making it much cheaper for countries to buy credits than cut emissions. Is this something that was predicted?
It was. I mean, we knew when we set the targets that Russia and Eastern Europe, basically the economies there were, you know, falling down, collapsing, if you will, and that, of course, cuts emissions. If you shut down a bunch of old steel mills, the emissions are less. So, in fact, they have reduced their emissions as a result of that economic collapse. But the issue is, do you let them sell the credits that that reduction reflects into the marketplace? And I think if we do, it cuts the price to zero. It decreases the effort that we want to have in terms of making progress. So I think we'll have to have an agreement at Copenhagen or after that takes care of the Russians. They have a legitimate concern. That is their baseline. They did reduce their emissions, though it was because of an economic collapse. So I think we need to compensate them in another way, not compensate them through carbon credits that would undermine the future treaty, but rather financially. And I think in Europe, that's what they're going to do. They have the same issue with Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, and so on. Their emissions also went down. And I think the answer is to provide other kinds of compensation that don't undermine the goal we have of cutting emissions dramatically in the future.
Lewis is on the Democrats' line in Freeport, Texas.
Yes, I'm calling about the green atmosphere. Do you think that NASA is mostly to blame for this, that by them launching shells, punching a hole into the atmosphere? I've noticed every time they launch, there's bad weather follow the launch. So could you speak on that, please?
I'm not aware of a problem in terms of, I've seen some of this stuff about chemicals being shot into the atmosphere to produce rain and that sort of thing, but I don't see that as part of the major climate change problem. The only one I really see in the atmospheric issue is this question about airplanes, and the contrails that come out of the exhaust of jet planes certainly causes more global warming than other kinds of emissions, and that's an issue that we really have to address. And that's one probably won't be addressed at Copenhagen, but in the near future we'll need to look at it. But otherwise, I don't see a big issue there.
Let's go to Lufkin, Texas, where Eddie's on the Independent line. Good morning, Eddie.
Good morning. I would just like to address the skeptics of global warming and say that while there is a dispute about the human impact on global warming, it is very real. The science was developed by savant Arrhenius back in 1904. He came up with the idea of a greenhouse effect, along with his many other accomplishments. The estimate for the next period of high temperatures was 3,000 years at the time he made his calculations, and it has since been lowered to just 300 years, and we can expect it'll be lowered even more as our energy production continues to release CO2. Also, if there is this dispute about the University of East Anglia emails, there are many emails, and many of them are taken out of context and they're quoting. If you'd like, you could check them at eastangeliaemails.com.
I agree with the caller.
Okay. What will your organization be doing at Copenhagen? What role do you play? Of course, you're the president for the Center for Clean Air Policy. How involved are non-governmental groups in the process?
We're quite involved. We work very actively in China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia on the ground. So we work a lot with the delegates from those countries, helping them design the programs that they will be proposing here at Copenhagen. We also bring together heads of delegation to 30 countries on periodic basis for sort of shadow discussions outside the formal discussions. So we're always trying to help find where the agreement could be reached, because we have a good sense of, we play in every market. We're very active in Europe. We have an office in Brussels, and we're active here in the United States. So we're one of the groups that's trying to help foster the agreement and move the ball forward. So we try to advise delegates from all different countries about the ways that coming together might occur.
Okay, Eddie, or rather Alyssa is calling on the Republicans line from Cleveland, Ohio. Hi, Alyssa.
Hi. Yeah, first I'd just like to recommend a book. It's called Environmental Overkill. I don't know if you possibly read it already.
No, I haven't
but
seen
it's
it.
by a scientist with a marine biology PhD, and she was the governor of Washington State, actually. But with the global warming or climate change, whoever uses which thing, we know climate change is happening, but I think people disagree on why. I mean, I believe climate change is a natural cycle, and we as humans are arrogant to think that we can change or significantly alter any weather patterns on Earth. I don't know what you believe. I mean, I believe in conserving, but not to the point of advocating, population control, which was the #1 topic at the first Earth Summit in '92 in Brazil. And I don't know if you were there or had anything to do with it, but I mean, back then, they were advocating early on in the movement. Environmentalists were telling us in the 70s that humans were the cause of the coming ice age. Acid rain would burn our skins, in 10 years, and it just never came true.
I think you raised some interesting points. I mean, as you say, with acid rain, that's a case where we worked a lot on that, and that's a case where significant progress was made. We put in a cap and trade program for the first time. We cut the emissions dramatically, and we're seeing recovery of the lakes in the Northeast and other areas, and we're seeing significant benefit in terms of health effects. And I think climate change is similar. You're right, there's some uncertainty out there in terms of the climate change side, but I think you have to think about this in terms of what are the risks and what are the risks of inaction. And a number of studies, Lord Stern in England and others have done studies showing that the kinds of impacts we're talking about from climate change are so substantial that it makes sense to take action now and not wait and put us in a tough spot, because CO2 emissions last for more than 100 years in the atmosphere. So today's emissions will be there heating the planet 100 years from now. So unlike SO2, where it lasts a few months in the atmosphere, these are very long-lived emissions. So we can't really afford to not take action. And I think you look at what's being done. China, for example, announced their target on Friday, and they have a very aggressive energy efficiency program, dwarfs the kinds of things we've done in the United States. And basically that makes sense from two perspectives. Makes sense from perspective of dealing with the climate change problem. It also makes sense from an energy perspective. They are very dependent on oil, imported oil, just like we are, and going to energy efficiency saves them big spending on oil and leads them to a much more efficient economy. So these are win-win opportunities. They're opportunities for new jobs. I think you said you're from Ohio. Great opportunity for Ohio to develop, instead of looking backward at the old cement and steel industries, look forward at the steel industry of the future, where we're making windmill blades and we're making new technologies of all kinds to play. We've seen this in the stimulus packages. We've been very pleased. The U.S. package has 20% of the money spent on green technologies, green jobs. China spent 50% of their stimulus package on it, an equal package to the size of ours, and Korea spent 80%. Obviously, these countries see these new jobs and new technologies as the future, and they're rushing to compete with us, and I think that's where we have to look at this as well. Thinking about climate change, it's not like acid rain where I'm putting a widget on the smokestack to clean up the pollution. It's costing me efficiency and all that sort of thing. In this case, improving efficiency, making us more competitive, building new jobs and new opportunities. So it's a win-win proposition. It's not a win-lose proposition like often is the case with a lot of other environmental regulation.
Democrats line caller Mustafa is in Reno Valley, California.
Hello, good morning.
Welcome.
Morning.
First of all, thanks CSPAN, and I'm really glad that the previous callers who called in are very informed regarding this issue. First of all, I would like to discuss or talk about the fact that as a postgraduate student, I know that most professors would actually do anything to get a grant from the government or from other companies, and if it wasn't for the fact that we have this, global warming alarmist, all these climate scientists would be out of a job. I believe this issue, or I know this issue is about cap and trade, and personally I see cap and trade as not really reducing emissions, and it's been proven that it wouldn't really help emissions in that sense. And the fact that major corporations, just like Mr. Helme said, are backing this, and governments are backing this, that should raise an eyebrow, even if you're not a scientist. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
I think you're a little cynical on this. My sense is that corporations see this as a real threat to their futures in terms of what this means to our planet, and they see this opportunity in terms of new technologies and new opportunities. So I think there's obviously a win-win here for them as well, but there's also a larger social altruism that's part of what's motivating their action. On the question of cap and trade, it's all about the cap. How hard, how tough is the cap? If the cap is set at a level that requires significant reductions, like we did in acid rain, we set it at a 50% reduction from current levels, and we got those reductions. We dramatically reduced the amount of SO2 in the atmosphere through the cap and trade program. And we can do the same thing here. It's all about where you set the cap. It's all about how tough the regulation is. It's not about the mechanism. The mechanism works. Now, if you set a really weak target, obviously nothing happens. So it's just like any kind of environmental regulation, except in this case, with the trade element here, we make it possible to do it more cheaply. So we maximize the environmental bang for our buck. But I think the test is always look at the number. What is a cap? Is it a real cap? Is it going to reduce emissions significantly or not? And that's the test you have to apply. And cap and trade is a good way to save money while cutting emissions.
Let's go to Richmond, Virginia. Renee is on the independent line.
Yeah. I'm Mr. Helme. I appreciate the opportunity to make this call. And I'm in full agreement with what you're saying. I lived 6 years in Tokyo and 12 years in Europe, and global warming is real. The people that call you that don't believe it, well, the joke's on them. We are the only country in the world that haven't signed the Kyoto Treaty, and we are the biggest pollutant in the whole world. And I'm sorry to hear that these people are not believing. We drive the biggest cars here, waste so much gas. We have the worst chemical plants that are inefficient. We have coal plants that haven't been updated for years. And this is really getting worse. And I believe in clean energy. I have solar power in my home. I try to recycle as much, which I've learned in Europe and in the Far East. In Japan, you go out on a typical day in Tokyo, and you can see how much pollution the air has done to the country. I mean, to the Tokyo area, because you have the Kawasaki, which is outside Tokyo, which is the industrial power of Japan.
Let's get a response from our guest. Thanks, Renee. Let's get a response from Ned Helme.
I would agree with you. Japan's been a leader, and I think we're seeing a number of countries, as I said, stepping up together to every major country. Last week we heard from Korea, we heard from Russia, they raised their target significantly. We heard from Brazil, a major increase in their target. So I think there's a real sense that around the world, everybody gets it. Everybody is joining in, everybody's stepping up, and they see the need to reduce emissions. And I think we are going to solve this problem. I'm very encouraged by the President's action last week, his announcement, and I think we're on the right track, and Copenhagen is going to be a success and lead to further action next year to finalize the details of the treaty.
Briefly, how significant is it that he will be stopping by?
I think it's significant. I think, people said, oh, why isn't he coming the second week? Obviously he's coming because he's going to the Nobel Prize event. But I think sending a signal early is important. The first week will be a week when the negotiators are really finalizing the details. So a step by the President coming at that point, it's still at a point where the game is still to be settled. So I think it's very useful, and I think the administration plans to have a number of cabinet secretaries making presentations throughout the week after the president's opening presentation. I think sends a very important signal. This is a sea change from where we were a year and a half ago. The president deserves a lot of credit. He put this back on the map during the campaign by saying he wanted to cut emissions to 1990 levels. That put the issue back on the table. That jump-started these negotiations, and I think we're now at the point to close, and I think it's very appropriate that he be there, and I think it'll make a difference.
Thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Ned Helme, President for the Center for Clean Air Policy. That's all for Washington Journal this